it's Sonia, Miss Yamani if you're nasty. Today I want to talk about my favorite podcasts. I'm going to talk about 8 of them, and I think they're podcasts you would enjoy too. But first, I want to talk about what podcasts are, because I know I'm a late adopter. With technology, I'm kind of behind the curve in things. So if people are always talking about podcasts around you and you're kind of like, what are those? I want to kind of briefly explain what those are. So podcasts are similar to talk radio shows. So like if you've ever watched the Tavis Smiley show where he does interviews with people, celebrities about their books coming out or albums coming out, or he talks about a specific subject and he has subject matter experts come on the show. That's basically what a podcast is, except they're audio recordings, just like a talk radio show. But instead of being on the radio, they're streamed through other platforms. And those platforms are the same as an app that you would have to download. So podcasts are not on the radio, they're on streaming platforms. Platforms are apps that stream podcasts. They can be found in the App Store, on your phone, on your cell phone, laptop, or tablet. Podcasts are a collection of episodes with an overarching theme. So the theme may be race, money, cooking, pop culture, history, books, literally anything. So it's similar to Clark Howard's show. He talks about finance, but he's sometimes on the radio. Well, a podcast is the exact same thing, but not on the radio. Podcasts can be hosted by celebrities, journalists, or other everyday average people. They can be hosted by anybody. You could start a podcast. I could start a podcast. So the podcast has a host or co-hosts, and they just talk about things related to that overarching theme. Podcasts are also educational and entertaining. They usually contain interviews with celebrity guests or specialists within a particular field. And I like podcasts because I feel like they offer the ability to hear other perspectives, kind of be a fly on the wall and hear what people are talking about. So the next question is, how do you listen to podcasts? How do you find them? Podcasts are on platforms, again, which is an app that you would find in your app store. Some examples of podcast platforms would be Apple Podcasts, that's the name of it, or Audible, Google Podcasts, or Podcast One, things like that. So you would go to your app store on your phone, laptop, or tablet, and you would search podcasts, and you would you would download the app that allows you to listen to podcasts. Basically, the app is like a library of podcasts that you want to access through your app store. So in alphabetical order, my favorite podcasts are, number 1, Code Switch. And Code Switch is affiliated with NPR, so you know it's good quality. The co-hosts are Shireen Marisol Meraji and Jean Demby. And Shireen is a journalist. She's of Puerto Rican and Iranian descent, so you're going to get diversity. Jean brings an African-American male perspective, and they've both worked in journalism, so you get the professionalism. Before joining the podcast Code Switch, Jean worked in various positions with Huffington Post, the New York Times. So you're going to get educated, experienced, and woke co-hosts. So you get to hear their conversations on topics that they talk about. And on their website, their summary of their podcast says, "It's a fearless conversation about race and that you've been waiting for. Hosted by journalists of color, our podcast tackles the subject of race head on. We explore how it impacts every part of society, from politics and pop culture to history, sports, and everything in between. This podcast makes all of us part of the conversation because we're all part of the story." So they kind of touch on things that have to do with race, but it's not, it's not intense. It's not something that is going to be intimidating or uninteresting. No, it's going to be interesting content. And like I said, it's affiliated with NPR. They always have great content. So the second podcast I want to talk about is Ear Hustle. And this shirt may look familiar. That's how much I like the show. Ear Hustle is co-hosted by Nigel Poor, Rasan Thomas, and Earlonne Woods. This one is not hosted by journalists. It's hosted by an artist. I think Nigel Poor was a photographer or something like that. I think she was teaching a class. From what I read, she was teaching a class in San Quentin prison. And this is how the podcast idea kind of got discovered. Her and two other inmates, well, she wasn't an inmate, but two inmates in San Quentin and Nigel Poor created the podcast. And it's about everyday life inside San Quentin prison. Originally, that's what it was, but Earlonne Woods recently got out of prison. So now the podcast kind of shifted to everyday life within the prison and outside of the prison. And so it's just really interesting because you just get to witness people come out of prison and what life is like for them. It's an award-winning podcast. It's the first podcast created and produced in prison. They talk about stories about the lives of prisoners, from anything from their favorite movie to relationships between the prisoners and the correction officers, things like that. The episode about their favorite movies, it was funny because the movie The Notebook came up as some of their favorite movies, and like sometimes the prisoners have to act really hard and tough, and they said that they cried watching The Notebook. So I thought that was really tender. So usually prisoners are out of sight, out of mind, and they're kind of forgotten by society. So I like this podcast because it kind of sheds light on not just what life is like behind bars, but it also tells humanizing stories of the prisoners. It's very entertaining. It's very well done. Their website, the summary of their podcast says, "Ear Hustle brings you the daily realities of life inside prison, shared by those living it, and stories from the outside post-incarceration." So about the Ear Hustle podcast, one day I wore this shirt out in public, and someone kind of approached me about it, and we kind of bonded over our love for the podcast. And we just talked about our favorite episodes, and it felt really good to, talk to other people who were into the same thing you were into. I like it. The third podcast is Hotboxin with Mike Tyson. The co-host is Mike Tyson and Evan Britton. I guess they're both athletes. I guess Evan Britton, I wasn't familiar with him previous to the podcast, but I guess he was an NFL player. So they're not journalists. They're um, both professional athletes or retired athletes. So you kind of get a less polished um, session, but you get real. Mike Tyson is real. So their thing is to smoke weed on the show. And they just talk with celebrity guests. It could be anywhere from like Eminem was one of their more recent ones that I listened to. Oh, Van Jones also. They just talk to everybody, athletes, everyone. Um, so Van Jones, if you don't know, is an attorney. The Game and Eminem, rappers. They talk to athletes and other prominent people. Um, I remember one episode I listened to Busy Bone, who was a rapper. He was on there, and I learned that he had been kidnapped as a child, and he was found by John Walsh, and he wrote a memoir. And so things like that, like how bizarre, and nobody's ever heard of that. So I was like blown away by that. I thought you would have at least heard something about it. So I want to read that memoir. It sounds interesting. On their website, their summary about their podcast is: listen as Mike Tyson, the baddest man on the planet, pours his soul into conversations with fascinating minds, celebrities, and athletes in a studio full of smoke, along with the cosmic millennial sidekick, former NFLer Evan Britton. Kid Dynamite dives deep into the issues impacting us all today. This show will change the way you see the world. It's really good. And I also have a new respect for Mike Tyson because he kind of has humbled himself. He talks a lot about how his ego got the best of him in the past. He talks about how he acted out because he had a low self-esteem. He talks about how he grew up like in the slums of New York, or how he was bullied and things like that. So I think he's pretty deep sometimes. You know, he always asks his guests what's their purpose, or what do you think the meaning of life is, things like that. And it could be due to smoking weed that could make you get real deep. I don't know. I did not inhale. Before I move on, who is going to watch the Mike Tyson versus Roy Jones Jr. fight on November 28th? I know I want to. I thought I saw Mike Tyson out of shape, and I did not think he was going to be able to enter the ring again, ever again. And then he lost weight, he got into shape, and now I'm kind of getting excited. So I'm trying to figure out how to order that because I don't have cable. But moving on, number 4 is Kwik Brain. And the host of that is Jim Kwik. Jim Kwik is a man who overcame a brain injury from when he was younger. And he's a brain and memory trainer to elite mental performers, including many of the world's leading CEOs and celebrities. That's what I got off of the website. But he's very upbeat, and he's very interested in brain health and increasing the brain capacity, speed reading, retaining more information. And he talks about little tricks that everybody can use, such as how to remember people's names. And he's very relatable because you know how you meet someone in an introduction and immediately you forget their name. He talks about that. I find the podcast very short but interesting. He also has guests on the show who are specialists in this area, or authors of books that wrote about this subject matter. He's into increasing memory, speed reading, learning new skills, things like that. I'm not really into speed reading or learning how to speed read. I took a speed reading class one time, and I'm just not into it because they just want you to skim through things. I'm not a skimmer. I'm a very detailed person. I want to hang on every word. I want to paint the picture in my mind. And for me, that kind of cements it when I read every word. Read slow, take my time. Reading fast, I mean, that might have its purpose, but for me, I don't have the need for that or the desire. But I just thought I would insert that. On his website, the summary about his podcast says, Kwik Brain is a fun, fast-paced show designed to help busy people learn and achieve anything in a fraction of the time. You will discover Kwik's favorite shortcuts to read faster, remember more, and supercharge your greatest wealth-building asset, your brain. The fifth podcast I want to talk about is Latino USA. The host is Maria Hinojosa. I love that name. My friend from high school, her name is Sonia too, but her last name was Hinojosa. And so we went to a suburban, predominantly white high school, but her and I would walk down the halls and you would hear people saying, Hinojosa, it's not like a basic last name, like, something short, like Cruz. It's, Hinojosa. With a silent H. So anyways, Maria Hinojosa is Mexican-American. She is an award-winning journalist. She's worked for PBS, CBS, WNBC, CNN, NPR, and MSNBC. So you're getting somebody very experienced, an actual journalist. So they know how to ask questions. They know how to interview people, how to talk to guests. So it's going to be more professional, more polished, but it's going to be very interesting. Maria Hinojosa is also an author. She recently released her memoir, which I really want to read. It's on my book list. So that podcast covers various stories, issues, anything related to various Latinx cultures and communities. On the website, their summary of the podcast says it's based in Harlem, founded in 2010 by an award-winning journalist, Maria Hinojosa. Futuro Media is committed to telling stories often overlooked by mainstream media by expanding narratives as we report on issues where we see a lack of racial equity. So this podcast is affiliated with NPR. So again, you're going to get great content. Number 6 podcast is Snap Judgment. And that's hosted by Glenn Washington. Man, I remember when this podcast first came out, I was really into it. It's more about storytelling. So let's see. This is the blurb on the host, Glenn Washington, that I got off of the website. Before creating the Snap Judgment radio show, Glenn worked as an educator, diplomat, community activist, actor, political strategist, fist shaker, mountain hollerer, and foot stomper. Glenn composed music for the Kunststoff dance performances in San Francisco, rocked live spoken word poetry in Detroit, joined a band in Indonesia, wrote several screenplays, painted a daring series of self-portraits, released a blues album, and thinks his stories are best served with cocktails. I mean, just as much colorful personality that was in that summary. That is the host. I mean, he really has a lot of personality. I actually saw the show live and he hosted it. It was really good. It was more intense live. It's kind of like spoken word, but they're telling stories rather than, poetry or it's like a longer story. but they have like music or like theatrical music to accompany the storytelling. It's really good. So the host is skilled at stories and telling stories, and he's very entertaining. But he's not the one who tells the stories. It's different people telling different stories. On the website, the summary of this podcast says, the Snap Judgment Radio Show and podcast mixes real stories with killer beats to produce cinematic, dramatic, kick-ass radio. Snap's raw musical brand of storytelling dares listeners to see the world through the eyes of another. Oh, during the live show, they told one story. Oh my gosh. I cried. Oh my gosh, it was so touching. I don't know, like I said, it's intense. It's like spoken word, how it pierces your soul. It's just creates a visual scene in your head. But yeah, I think it was Glenn Washington's story. I think it was something about the school bus. It was like he was bullied every time he got onto the school bus. Oh, it's so sad. But it always ends happy. Number 7 is the Stoop. And the co-hosts of the Stoop are Hannah Baba and Leila Day. Hannah is a Bay Area journalist. She speaks Arabic and she's Sudanese American. Leila is also a journalist. I didn't know about these co-hosts before I heard them on the podcast. They may be more popular in the Bay Area. On the website, it said that they hosted a lot of events in the Bay Area, so people may know of them. And I like this podcast because I feel like it's more about the Black diaspora. They put more of an immigrant perspective into their conversation, and I like that. On the website, the summary of their podcast says, the Stoop podcast digs into stories that are not always shared out in the open. Hosts Leila Day and Hannah Baba start conversations about what it means to be Black and how we talk about Blackness. It's a celebration of Black joy with a mission to dig deeper into stories that we don't hear enough about. The next podcast is Yes Girl, and the hosts are Charlie Penn and Corey Murray. This podcast is somehow affiliated with Essence magazine. I don't know. But on the website, the summary of their podcast says, celebrity interviews, pop culture, and unapologetic perspective. From week to week, they're uplifting everybody who is taking Black culture a little higher. They talk to a lot of celebrities. I listened to this podcast quite a bit, but I stopped when it was, when the pandemic happened, because they couldn't record in the studio. They were like doing Zoom calls, and I did not like the audio. So I took a break from listening to that until they figured out a better way to run the podcast. But I just want to say in closing, none of these podcasts are specific to any one group. They're not just for men or for women or for Latinx or Black communities. They're for everybody. They offer a diverse perspective and diverse topics. And if you don't know a lot about Latinx or Black cultures, these podcasts would be a good introduction to what people are talking about, but in a fun and entertaining way. Well, I hope that you found this video useful and that maybe you enrich your life listening to some of these podcasts. Let me know which ones you listened to, which ones sound interesting. If you're already listening to them, which ones you love. So, thank you. Bye.